Hello and welcome to Merging or Taking Over a Practice Contract. If you're here today watching this, I imagine you're in a position where you are considering a practice merger, or you have heard of a local practice that is perhaps planning to close and you have to look at the pitfalls of taking on a practice contract, which is normally as an APMS contract. I'm hoping that today a little talk through some of the things that you'll discover as you go through that will help you work through any difficulties and help you come to a decision of whether this is the right move for you. There is a lot of work involved with merging or taking over a practice contract, and it is something to not go into lightly. It needs a lot of discussion and thought across your whole surgery. Those of you that haven't been on any of my webinars before or watched any of my videos that I've made, my name is Luann Stewart, and I, like many of you, am a practice manager, still working in general practice full time. And the reason that GP Excellence have asked me if I would do a talk on merging or taking over a practice contract is I have worked in both these scenarios before. I have worked through two merges, getting to the point where we were about to merge two different practices. Both then didn't merge in the end, but I think there was a lot to be learned from that. And I also think it's a very worthwhile thing to not look at that as a negative, but think if it wasn't quite right, it is better to stop it before we get to the point where we've merged and we're not happy. I have also been a surgery who has taken over an APMS contract when a contract has been handed back. And I have been a surgery who has been part of the fallout, as it were, when a different practice contract was handed back and the patients were sent all over to the local surgeries. So I've had quite a bit of understanding of what can go wrong as well as what can go right. And hopefully the learning that I have had may help you in your final decision making. So what are we going to talk about today? Both in merging and in taking over a contract, there's a lot of things to consider. There are patients, there's buildings and the estates that go with them. Who owns them? Are they owned by the practices, or are they owned by someone like NHS Properties or a private rental? We have to consider the ICB's position in this, all of the staff, which includes TUPEing staff. We have to think about CQC as well as all of our providers. That can be people that provide various items to you. It could be your clinical consumables or your stationery providers. It could be your gas and electricity. We need to think about bank accounts, accountants, any solicitors that are involved in anything. We need to consider our PCN, our clinical systems, so if you're EMIS or System 1, and thinking about merging those clinical systems at some point and what that would entail, and many other things also should be on that list. PCSE, quite a big one, and they do take quite some work getting everything correct with them. So we're going to start by thinking first about taking over a contract, because that often can go into a merge situation, or at least the patients can end up working and coming into your practice list eventually, but sometimes it's worked as a separate contract. So when does this happen? Why does a contract suddenly become available? Well, often these days it's because of single-handed GPs retiring. They can't find anyone to take over their contract. They make a decision that some will merge with you and then retire. Others will just make a decision that they want to stop, hand back their contract, and then the ICB will work to have somebody manage that contract for a few months until the patients have been given the opportunity to move to various local practices, and then the contract will normally come to an end. Sometimes it can happen if it's a very speciality contract that's been given at some point, and that will often sit alongside a practice's main contract. That can happen occasionally. In areas where something new is happening, there can be APMS contracts held as a university opens to have an on-site university doctor, but then that will perhaps eventually become a branch surgery. It can happen if there's a particular speciality area. I know of a contract that lasted 3 or 4 years in the end, that was put in place due to refugees and asylum seekers coming in, and they had one GP to handle everything, and they put an APMS contract in place to run that, and that was bid for. Sometimes GPs are now these days handing back their contracts for financial reasons. Very sad to see in the newspapers and on the news of some big surgeries that hand back their contracts and make the decision that they no longer want to be partners within a business, particularly if the finances are really bad, and therefore their contracts are handed back to the ICB, who has to then have someone manage all of those patients. And because that takes time to let the patients pick which surgeries they want to be in, because that is always a patient choice, sometimes the decision is to have an APMS contract for 6 months or 12 months while the patients have time to find which GP surgery will work for them and give them a little bit of breathing space. There are also a lot fewer, but some situations where a GP is asked or told to hand back their contract. This is a really challenging situation, and if you're ever in this situation, I would certainly advise that you get some legal advice to help you through some of those areas, because if you take on a contract where somebody is unwilling to hand back their contract but has been perhaps ordered to by the ICB, then it can be quite an uncomfortable situation while you are taking that contract on. This is something that I have actually been part of, and it was a very challenging time, so don't take it lightly. So when you take over an APMS contract for a 6-month or a 12-month period, it's often thought of as a caretaker arrangement. That's a generalized term, but it is one you will hear bandied about. And it's where a contract will be put in place for 6 months or a year with the definite date of closing that contract. Even as it starts, it's not a contract that it's going to be renewed or even considered for renewal. You are literally taking on a contract to close down the surgery. And this is when a GP has left suddenly. So that could be, again, where a contractor has been asked to hand back their contract. They have handed back their contract due to financial issues without much notice, or it can also be in a case where a single-handed GP has passed away and therefore it needs to become an emergency situation. And in those cases, there is a lot of procedures to run through, but they run through very, very quickly. Generally, the ICB will approach the PCN of the surgery where the surgery originally was placed within a PCN who has handed back their contract. And they will ask, especially if there is time to do so, they will ask the PCN if the PCN would like to take over this contract as a PCN. So therefore, the entire PCN would be running the contract in a joint manner. They will also, if that isn't possible, they will also ask if any single practice within the PCN would like to take over that contract with the agreement of the rest of the PCN. And the reason that happens is because they would like PCN populations to remain the same, if at all possible, although that doesn't take away the patient choice to then decide to move outside the PCN if they're in the right catchment area to do so. That can often happen more if you're in the inner city areas where you've got lots of practices competing for each other's patients. It sounds like a really good idea for a PCN to run an APMS contract together, because you will have more staff across the PCN. They may be able to help and handle working together to cover all of the days that this contract needs to be run for. But there are also the pitfalls then of all those surgeries perhaps working slightly differently and having to decide who is going to take the lead roles in deciding how things are going to happen. That can even be in the way that our receptionists book our appointments, or what type of clinician actually sees the patients involved. So although it sounds like a great plan to have a PCN running it, if it's a very quick decision, sometimes that takes a lot more planning, because you are having to plan how to work together. So it is something that needs to be considered in both cases, and the ICB will definitely approach you as a PCN to run a practice. If it is a sudden decision, you need some really quick communications within your team. When it happened to me, although there had been rumblings that a practice would be closed, we were given a week's notice, with only 24 hours notice to have somebody actually present in that practice and doing a handover. That's very challenging when you get that phone call, to know that you have to liaise with your team, perhaps out of hours or first thing in the morning, to organise cover there. And some of that will depend on what staff would be remaining, and whether they would be able to have the skills to run everything that needs to be run. We do need to remember that when we take over an APMS contract, this is not like having a branch surgery. That surgery needs to be open all hours, 8 till 6:30, as your own surgery does. It can't have regular closures, which you might do with a rural branch surgery, because they have their own population list who are entitled to that full GP cover. So you need to make sure that you're in a position to cover full time and not have closures, assuming it is like a branch surgery. It is not. It's on its own contract. So if you're in the position where you decide that your surgery would like to take over an APMS contract that has come up for grabs, the ICB may ask you to write a business case. In most cases, they will ask you to, but different ICBs can work differently in some cases. To write a good business case, you need to gather all the required information, not only about your own surgery, but also the surgery who needs caretaking. Do they have a slightly different population to you? Are the patients different? Are they more deprived, less deprived? Do they have different surgical needs? And you have to put within that business case how you would take care of those patients. Are you planning to get more staff? Are you TUPEing their staff? How would this run for you to make sure that it is fair and equitable for everybody concerned? You need to include headings within that business case, and then some blurb underneath to explain how you would do that. And you need to consider finance, the population, the TUPEing of staff, how you will communicate the difficulties and changes to your patients. And you need to also have in your business case the ICB and CQC as headings, and how you would deal with the ICB and CQC on various areas to make sure that you are being fully transparent. You need to also have an area considering the estates, because if this practice that may be handing back their contract is in a position where it has its own building, we need to work out how that would be handled, or if there are rents to be paid. Have we got agreement from the landlords? Is everything going to be in place? How would that work? And we need to think about the IT systems. Are they both on the same system? Are you working to equal systems, or are some of the systems on, say, System 1 and some on EMIS? Cross systems are a little harder if there is going to be an eventual merge of these systems, if you are planning to take over the patients. And it could be a case of having to re-register everybody rather than actually merging the IT systems if you are working with two different systems. If you're only working with one system, it is often a 2 to 3 month notice to actually have a merger of systems. So it is something that needs considering in the early days of taking over. If you've only got a 6 months APMS, for instance, by the time you're into month 2, you really need to have your IT merge put into place with a date. So there's a lot to think about, and it's a lot of work that comes often to the management team. So you need to be fully aware that you are not going to be able to do all of the work within the merge for within the takeover of the APMS for one person. You will have to have a strong team around you that is prepared to work on this. Even if the PCN are not taking over the contract, but they are simply allowing one practice to take over the contract, there will need to be lots of discussions held within the PCN and also any other local surgeries if you're in a particularly sort of town centre type area where you have lots of surgeries in different PCNs, but that have crossover areas of population. And the reason we need to have these discussions is if you take over an APMS contract for 6 months, it is not a done deal that those patients will become your patients. And you need to have that in consideration, that you will have to talk to local surgeries because the patients will have a choice which surgery they eventually go to. And the 6 months contracts, the short contracts, are normally put in place for the patients to start willingly moving and re-registering with other with other surgeries. And then there will be an agreement at the end where the ICB will divide the last patients, normally in favour of the person that's taken on the APMS contract. That will normally be part of the consideration because you have helped them, so they will then reward that help. But they will not give you all of the patients, and it will often have to be a shared agreement. And you need to make sure you understand all of those agreements with the ICB before you go ahead and agree to an APMS contract, because an APMS contract for only 6 months really never runs at a profit. It is normally a loss-making contract in that time because the patients are depleting very, very quickly. It's normally a good idea to have a conversation with the ICB ahead and guarantee the population for 6 months rather than 3. They can put those guarantees in place because if the patients start to re-register elsewhere, you could be running an entire contract with hardly any patients, and that can become quite costly if you have to have a GP on site at all times. And the ICB do, once the agreement is in place of who is going to take that contract, and they do agree with the decision on that contract, the ICB will help you and organise that all the legalities are covered. They will organise the new contract. It will just need signing at your, heavily reading and signing at your end. And they will give you a really strict timetable to do that. So contracts normally need signing very quickly, so that all the legal areas can start to be informed of exactly how things are going to work for that surgery. Communications will need putting out very quickly, and we will talk about that as we go through the slides. And in the middle of all of this mayhem, where you may be feeling exhausted with everything that you have to handle and deal with, we need to remember the staff that are already working at that practice. They have suddenly found that their partnership or single-handed partner that was running that contract is now no longer going to be the lead partner if you are in a takeover rather than a merge position. And therefore, they are going to have new bosses. And sometimes that's very frightening for them. So we need to be kind and we need to have meetings regularly with those staff to ensure that they feel comfortable and happy and understand the situation. And we need to remind them and remind our own team that strict TUPE rules are actually have to be applied. For that, if you've never worked through TUPE, and even if you have, I would suggest that you get some very good HR advice. It's not easy to make sure that you do everything 100% legally. There are different packages you can look for. So some of the big HR companies that you will have heard of, like Peninsula or Avonshaw, will run a specific TUPE project, which they will charge a certain amount of money, and they will run all your contracts, organise your contracts for you, and organise everything. It comes at quite a high cost. Included in that cost is normally some insurance of cover if anybody sues the organisation. There are also chances to perhaps contact your local branch of your LMC, who often will have an HR department who will be able to help you. This is normally more reasonably priced, and if it's quite a straightforward TUPE with not too many staff and everybody is coming across with no redundancies, sometimes that is the easier way. If you are getting into redundancies of staff, then that can be more complicated, and you definitely need to get legal advice to make sure you're making the right staff redundant. All staff must be issued that are TUPE'd a new contract for the APMS contract, and then if they merge across to your actual main surgery at some point, then once again they will have to have new contracts. So it could be 2 new contracts, it could be 1, depending on how you are planning to work this system. There are different ways. If you know that you will eventually be taking over that contract, it is possible to TUPE the staff to your staffing team, and then with the consideration in their contract that they will be able to work at their initial surgery if there is an estates issue. Your new contracts must include their original TUPE date. So if you have a staff member who has worked for 20 years for the practice that you are taking over, that will be the start date that is considered as far as annual leave or any sick pay or anything that they get extra holiday, extra payments for. So you must make sure that you can have on there a start date with yourselves, but then it must say their TUPE date is the date that is to be considered. And their new contract must be at least as good as their old contract. You can improve them. There's absolutely no reason to not improve a contract. If your current surgery gives more annual leave or better cover for sickness or a higher rate of pay, of course that can be contributed to the staff that are TUPEing over. If you give something that's lesser than those things, you cannot enforce that onto your new staff. They are perfectly entitled to the pay rate or amount of annual leave or anything else that they had a better deal with under their old contract. Those parts of the contract must be TUPE'd across for those particular staff members. You don't have to then match that across to all of your staff, but you do need to keep in mind that if you have staff that are coming in on better contract deals, that may upset your current staff. So keep everything in mind and work through any problems as you work through that, because it is really vital that we make sure that we keep our own regular staff happy, as well as look after these staff that have been left in a difficult and challenging situation. Taking over NHS pensions, there are very, very strict criteria to follow, and you need to work directly with NHS pensions on that particular area of work. And if there are redundancies, as mentioned, you need to make sure who will be paying that redundancy money. Is it the original contractor? Or is it yourself? Are you making those staff redundant, or are they being made redundant before the end of the contract? It makes a very big difference, which is why I've suggested that if you are in a situation with redundancies, you do need to get some legal help in there, and possibly legal HR help for writing those new contracts. But make sure you are fully covered and fully aware of what you're taking on before you take on any new contract. There will be some paperwork that after you've watched this video that you will be able to apply to get. These are my working papers. These are paperwork that I have used in the past in TUPE situations. And these do include a TUPE form for you to fill out the details that you'll need to have in front of you for getting any of these companies to do a new contract for you. Or if you're writing your own contracts, to have all that stuff in there in consideration for you. So you need to have that in place. And there is an example as well, and this is not my document, this is an NHS pensions document that has come out, that is a spreadsheet, but to give you the idea of exactly what you will need to get information-wise from NHS pensions. But you will need to apply for your own version of that because they are all numbered. This is just an example for you to have a look at to get some ideas of the information required. I would also suggest, having been in a challenging situation of taking on staff, to ensure that their pensions have been paid correctly to NHS pensions, because you don't want to find yourself foul of receiving a large bill from NHS pensions if the pensions haven't been handled correctly under the prior management and partnership situation. That's just a piece of very personal advice from me, because I have been in the situation where we did have to work through all the unpaid pensions, which took some time. You also need to really strongly consider your workforce planning. This is even on a 6-month takeover of contract. On a short contract, is there a manager that is staying? Sometimes the practice manager will stay, and therefore they will be able to run that APMS contract, sitting in situ, making sure the day-to-day stuff is sorted out. You may choose to take the finances because you are responsible at that stage for those finances under your own partners. So therefore that's something that is up for consideration. If the manager is also leaving, which can happen, you've got to consider, is it worth putting a manager in place for a contract where they are dispersing the patients? Is it worth going out for that? Or have you got a member of staff who is keen to be upskilled that can perhaps be there for the day-to-day work? I would recommend, if you are doing that and you are merging IT systems, perhaps make sure that it's somebody that's pretty good at IT, because there is a lot of IT work in merging the systems across. If you are going to go through that and put in another member of staff to manage the contract sort of on a day-to-day basis, managing the staff that are there, make sure they're aware that the staff may be in a sensitive position, or they may be dealing with a lot of locums or locum admin staff coming in while the contract's being closed down if staff start to scatter. So there are things to consider. There's also a lot of admin work in moving all of the patient Lloyd Georges, even if they're already digital, across to, from PCSE, picking up work that perhaps hasn't been done. You can find out you're in a situation if a contract has been handed back, where people have stopped performing, and therefore there may be outstanding complaints, outstanding summarising, outstanding coding. So there could be a lot of admin work that needs picking up, and you will need someone in situ that can manage that day-to-day work and make sure it's getting done. But that doesn't always have to be a practice manager. You can upskill a member of staff, or you can get in a locum manager. There are plenty of locum managers now who'll take on a short-term contract, but remember that will be more costly, and add that in when you're working out the costings of taking over a contract. You need to work through, are all the staff staying? If some of them are leaving, you may have to consider, do they need to be replaced on a short-term basis? Have you got staff that can cover with maybe a little overtime, or are your own contracts written in a way that you are covered to work in any surgery, and therefore will they be prepared to take on some of this work? And that needs discussion with your team. It should not be enforced, because there is not anything in it for the team. There is something in it for your partners, potentially in the long run, as the population, if the population joins their surgery. There is not anything in it for your regular staff members, so therefore they need to be incentivized, encouraged, and asked, if you are asking them to take on extra work to assist you with this. There's also an awful lot of communications that need to go out, and they really do have to be worded in a particular manner. The ICB normally has a comms team that can assist you putting a comms plan together, because all the patients need to be informed what is happening. I have put a copy of a comms and engagement plan within the paperwork that you'll be able to apply for, but I would always suggest that if possible, get the ICB to assist you with that. It shouldn't come as a cost. The ICB should be able to provide you with that free of charge and help you get through that particular thing, because it is very challenging making sure the patients are made aware of everything. If it is a short-term contract and then the patients are being given a choice, there is often drop-ins for the patients to come in and talk through their concerns. Those drop-ins are generally organised by the ICB, and that is because if you as a practice are organising those drop-ins, it can be suggested that you will be encouraging those patients particularly to come to your own surgery, rather than a patient choice that they can go to any surgery. So that's something for you to consider. You may be asked to place on the walls posters for other surgeries saying they are welcoming patients. That is something that the ICB will possibly order you to do, and you need to not be in breach of that. You need to make sure that if you are asked to do something, that you follow it through, because it is all contractual as part of taking over that APMS contract. APMS contracts will have their own patient list, and as I say, this will be depleting throughout if you are only having a very short-term APMS. There are long-term APMS. We have one locally to me that's 10 years signed up for, which is a different scenario. But if it is a takeover where they are planning to then close that down completely and have those patients merge in with other contracts, they will have their own list that will start to deplete. And when this comes to an end, if you are taking over the closure of that and the list size mainly coming into your practice, once patients have had the opportunity to go to other practices, you will probably have to arrange that EMIS or System 1 merge, as we mentioned earlier. So there's lots and lots of work to get ready in that timing, and most of that work will fall to management or your IT leads. Excuse me. The one thing that often gets forgotten is your suppliers. Your suppliers, such as your flu vaccine companies or your companies that supply oxygen, things that only happen every 6 months or annually, you may forget about. So it is worthwhile getting a list of all the suppliers for that APMS contract, and then deciding, do you want to do anything with those companies? Do you want to let them, you do need to let them know that there are new people in charge, new bank accounts perhaps that things are going to be paid out of. Your flu vax could be booked for a year in advance. Do you want to make a stop to that? Or if you're planning to take most of those patients, will those flus perhaps be useful? So it's all things to think about. You also need to let PCSE know what's going on. We know that there can be challenges with how long things take within PCSE, but they do need informing, as there will be large records movements if that surgery is closing down, and they won't necessarily all be to you. So they need to have a bit of awareness that in the local area there will be lots and lots of movement. Generally, the ICB will have contacts within PCSE and they will help you with this, but you will have to be attending meetings and organising that. A lot of your time is going to be spent on this contract. And finally, CQC to think about. You need to make sure CQC is updated. If you're in a case of somebody handing back their contract and that particular doctor who is a registered manager is not coming across with you, you need to then find who is going to be the registered manager of that APMS contract and have them ready. The other thing that often happens with a contract where it's being closed down is it can often be in a situation of needs improvement. What do you need to put right? And this is a conversation you can have with CQC directly. If it's only a short-term contract for 6 months, there is some leniency if you approach CQC in the right way. And sometimes they will allow you to have more than the 6 months to get in place that needs improvement work, in which case by then the contract will have closed. If it is a longer contract, you may have an awful lot of improvements to put in place. Some of these improvements may be easy, and it's definitely worth having a look at that. I know that when I took over a contract, we had to put right a few of the estates things for health and safety, and they had to be done immediately. So that was something that we put in place. But some of the longer term things, such as summarising records or ensuring that all the coding was up to date that had been flagged previously, and you may have similar. They gave you longer. They understood that you were coming in, you were taking over a contract, you were trying to work with them, but make sure you work with CQC. And if you work with CQC, they generally will work with you and help you, because you are taking away one of their problems by taking over a surgery that's in needs improvement and hopefully bringing it up to the standard of your own surgery. And one final part of taking over that we're going to talk about, and that is problems in an unwilling takeover. Sometimes, and this really does happen, you may be asked to take back keys or removing laptops or contractor parts from the original partner. I would always recommend, if you're in this situation, you ask the ICB to physically back you as required. It is a very challenging thing to be left for a manager to do. And if you are in a unwilling takeover of a contract, you may need to make sure that you are not putting yourself in a too much of a difficult situation, and certainly not putting your team in a difficult situation. Not trying to scare you, it is just something that has happened within areas that I am aware of, and it's not a situation you want to find yourself in. Next, we're going to discuss merging. What happens when a practice decides to merge? Well, one thing I would say is make sure there's an awful lot of planning that goes into merging ahead of actually merging. This is why it's a good thing that it's 3 to 4 months for IT systems to merge, because actually the people planning is the worst thing, and you need to make sure that it's right. Are the teams going to be happy? You don't want to be losing staff. You don't want upset partners. So you need to make sure that you really can work together and that you are a similar type of practice that will flourish and grow together, rather than realizing that it isn't going to be like that too late. So we'd start really before it goes out to the whole team with partners and management, perhaps meeting and discussing, is this what we want to do? How will we work together? Even simple things like what would the new surgery be called? If you've got two practices of very similar sizes that decide to merge, there can even be a tussle over the name, and it might be that you need to form under a whole new name rather than just the slightly bigger surgery's name. Do you have really different finances? Is one of you a really high earning practice and one a lower earning practice? And how do you work within that to make sure that the partners feel that everything is fair and equitable and nobody's losing by this merge, but there is a gain in it for everyone? So you need to really understand the money and make sure that this is a viable thing to be doing long term. Sometimes there will be short term pain for the long term gain, and that's something that you need to consider and discuss with the partners. And also the managers will often meet away from the partners and discuss how things can work in a general manner together. Have you covered all bases? Is there going to be some upset with any shared working? I would strongly suggest that if two surgeries are merging or more than two surgeries, your team should be told at the same time that this is a possibility. Concurrent meetings can happen. Allow Teams links for people that can't be there. Don't let them hear it as gossip. It's an awful thing because people panic and worry about redundancy. Make it a very positive meeting, but make sure they happen at the same time, because it's amazing that even 30 minutes difference, people that know each other from different surgeries will start texting and phoning. So get those started at the same time and make sure your key people are there. This shouldn't be a manager telling your teams. This needs to be partners involved as well, because this is a really big thing for your teams and a lot of them will be worried. So make sure that that's there and it's a positive meeting. When you're initially meeting with the two sets of partners, you'll need to talk about where the merged team will work from. Is one of the buildings going to become a branch? Is that building going to go, or are they both joining together into some fabulous new build that's been organised by the ICB? Is this a reason for the merge, that you're going to be put in the same building, or maybe already in the same building, and this will be an easier way of doing things? Have as much information as you can to inform the team so they won't worry. It may not be a big deal to you to go an extra 2 miles to go to work if that's where one of the surgeries are. But if you've got staff members who don't drive, for instance, or are worried that there isn't enough parking for them, these are little worries that can really grow, and you don't want to get your staff upset. You need to take them with you on this journey. You need to consider mortgages and rents. What happens with those? Are you joining together and all buying into each other's buildings? Are they going to remain separate with the partners that already have them? Are there rents that will perhaps be ceased if one of the areas is not going to be used anymore? Have you given notice on that? There's an awful lot to be considered to make sure that you keep those areas manageable and part of your decision making. Then there's the management of staff. There will definitely be some TUPE. That will be exactly as we talked about before when we're taking over a surgery. If we are merging, either one lot of staff will TUPE into the other's payroll, or you may start a whole new payroll system and contract system that you both almost merge into under a new name. So that is something that needs considering. How much TUPE? It's normally easier if there is one very large surgery and one smaller surgery, and much smaller, that those staff TUPE across to the larger one. Just for convenience, it's much easier to do 6 contracts than 70, for instance. There will be the difficulties of organising with NHS pension. It just takes time. It is a little time consuming and a lot of paperwork. And then getting along. What are people with the same title going to do? Sometimes it's easier if you're clinical. Can we have 2 AMPs or 4? Yes, we can have 4. Then we get down to the nitty gritty. Who's the infection control leader? Are 2 people desperate to keep that? Can that be shared? If you've got particular areas like a safeguarding lead, again, can we look at sharing a position if it's really important to someone, or is someone happy to let it go because they were pushed into it anyway, or somebody had to do it, so they stepped forward. But the more challenging things are the areas where somebody is in charge. If you have a reception manager and now you suddenly have two, or a practice manager and now you suddenly have two, they can't muddle on as before. You need to clearly establish boundaries of who's going to do what parts of the job. Sometimes that's really easy. Sometimes people naturally fall into more operational or more financial parts of the job, and that suits both. But sometimes people are vying for the same work, and you've got to find a way of making sure that the best person perhaps to do that part of the job is going to be left doing it, but not at the point where that is unfair to somebody else, because you don't want to find yourself in grievances at this point. You want to try and work together and put together job descriptions under maybe the same title that you can work together on. So these can be complicated. Before you get to the merge point, also talk about different ways of working for clinicians. We may think, well, they're all GPs, but how do you deal with your on-call? Is there an on-call? Is there an on-call doctor of the day, or does everyone do a little bit? I've worked with both. How do you deal with your tasks, your visits? Do you have trainees? How's that trainee money shared and that trainee work shared? Does everyone take a turn at doing a tutorial, or just the lead trainer? How many appointments in a clinic? One of the surgeries on 15-minute appointments and one on 10. These are all things that need discussion, and they form part of your pros and cons to merge. So there is a document that you can get your hands on that is the pros and cons of merging, and that will be there for you when you can get your documents on after this webinar. So as before, TUPE is really strict rules, so get your HR advice. Your new contracts need to happen with that old contract as good as the new contract, or better. Redundancies, if they are going to happen, who's going to pay for them? Is it a joint payment because you've just decided, or is anyone really coming up for retirement soon, and is it just worth hanging on? So for instance, if you've got one practice manager that's young and another one that's planning to retire in 6 months, there is a natural leaving that can be worked towards, which is a much better way sometimes than paying out redundancy. So these are all things that need considering. And then we need to think about something as small as bank accounts and finance. You've talked through your clinical ways, you've worked out what your managers are going to do, you've figured out your estates, you think, well, what else can go wrong? This all looks great, everyone's happy. And then someone's really attached to their particular bank that they've worked with for 20 years. So we need to make sure whose is going to be the main bank account. How is that going to work? Letting PCSE know so that we can make sure that the money is going into the right account, because if it isn't, that's a real concern. Another thing is, do partners pay their own taxes, or do the practice pay them? I've worked in practices where they do both, and if the two work very differently and they are merging, is that an issue for them? Which way are they going to work? Because sometimes if people are used to their taxes being paid by you, they're not used to saving for them. Some partners do not want that to happen. And we need to make sure we're working the same, because otherwise it is really challenging for a practice manager to be putting away bits of tax for one person and not another. So we need to make sure that we have an understanding before we go ahead to merging on these sort of simple things to happen. Your practice number. If you're merging into one practice, generally someone's going to lose their P number or their practice number. Believe it or not, some people get really attached to these things. So it's a discussion, and it does need to happen. In some mergers, that may be something and nothing, and people really don't care. But if you don't discuss it, you don't know. So make sure all these tiny little bits are discussed, even down to Some practices provide coffee and tea for their staff. Others make the staff pay into a coffee fund. Simple little things that can cause upset need discussing and ironing out long before that merge happens. So the plan to a merge is quite lengthy. And then accounts. Who's your accountant? Can the accountant work with you to move the accounts together? But you may have different accountants, and those different accountants, again, people get attached to their accountant. So you need to make a decision between you, which accountant is going to be the accountant for the newly merged practice. All things to think about. We need to keep in mind there may be a partial year accounts if the merger is happening halfway through the year. And that's to ensure that the partners for each practice are paid fairly for the parts they have worked apart. And then there will be an end of year accounts for the merge time. So if you merge halfway through a year, you are going to have extra accountants bills, but that's a short-term problem, but it is something that you do need to be aware for and save. Again, as mentioned previously on taking over a contract, comms for your patients need to happen. There is a comms paper in the bundle and the ICB will help you with this. Your patients need to understand why there is a merge. You probably need to make sure that you've informed the PCN before the comms go out. Are you coming from two different PCNs? That's another issue that you need to make sure is ironed out. If you're from the same PCN, it's far easier. It takes 3 to 4 months, as mentioned previously, for your go live dates for your clinical supplier, EMIS, System 1, whichever one you're on, make sure that you've got that date planned really far in advance, and then everything merges. Make sure that if you are going through a clinical merge of two big practices, that you have really cleared everything and you've got time to clear it ahead of time, so that there can be a straightforward merge and get help from your ICB with the knowledge that the practices are going to have to perhaps close for an hour. They'll normally only let you have an afternoon, or that you're going to be working at reduced capacity while that clinical system, we can make sure it's working correctly, because it is quite a challenging thing merging two clinical systems together. Think about the time of year you're doing this. Do you want to be merging systems in the middle of a busy flu season when you've got all sorts of clinics going on that could get complicated? Start thinking about the timings. Is there a quieter time to do this? And that might be the time to make sure it's done. Also work with the IT at the ICB to make sure that your IT log of computers is merged together and they are aware that a computer from practice A is now being used out of practice B, particularly if the estates are all moving, because it will get complicated and you do need to be aware of this. If you are moving buildings, then it is even down to having to work out where each desk will fit, who has got a particular chair that they must have go with them into their new room, otherwise they won't be able to function. These are all things that sound very little, but they are very real to some people. Within your bundle of paperwork that you'll be able to receive, there is some work on how to move from one place to another, and whether furniture is worth taking with you. So I've got a spreadsheet that I have used, and you will have to just write over with the actual items, but it will give you an idea of how even simple things need to be looked at. There is also in there an IT document for showing how, when we move our IT systems from one building to another, how we can log that, and then that log can be passed across to the ICB. So hopefully, if you are going through a natural movement of building alongside a merger, this paperwork will just save you a little bit of time and save you having to form something for yourself, because it is challenging and you will have a lot to do without doing any extra stuff. CQC, you'll need to decide who will be the registered manager. You can have more than one, and I would totally recommend you have more than one. So perhaps whoever was registered manager at both places can both become registered managers at your new under your new merged practice. Make sure all your invoices are sorted out for your individual suppliers so that you've only got merged invoices, one invoice going forward. Why deal with two different accounts when you can have just one? That will take some time, and you will always forget something. So you will suddenly find you get one of your annual bills and think, my goodness, why didn't I sort that out? We're all human. So you may forget stuff, but it is worth working through and trying to merge as many of those as you can, just to cut back on the paperwork, and so you know where you are with the bank account at all times. If any of the practices are in a needs improvement status, you will need to work with CQC, but unlike that APMS short-term contract, you will be in a position where you have to get those improvements in place if you're keeping the same buildings and it was a building issue, or you're taking on that admin as a merged practice that perhaps has fallen behind. Anything like that, any health and safety needs to be put right, and put right quickly. So the CQC will probably trigger a visit. It generally does. And make sure, as I mentioned previously, that your flu suppliers have been merged, or if you're on using different suppliers, then obviously you don't have to merge them, but make sure that you don't forget you've got all this extra stock because it will have been booked 12 months in advance. Some of the medical consumables and the places that actually deliver medication that you might use in practice, like vaccines for travel vax and things, you do need to, it takes some time to get those to work across. It can be a few weeks getting new names put onto the contracts and getting them put together. So please make sure that you give yourself that time to do that and get everything in place. And one thing that people forget is keep monitoring the situation. If you've had a successful merge, first celebrate it with your team, thank your team, maybe arrange a day out, maybe arrange just a little bit of a lunch in the lunch break, a few sandwiches, something to say thank you to them. Keep them happy, but keep checking. Once that merge has gone through, you are going to be very, very busy with all the stuff, and so are they. So don't forget, this is big change for some of them, and therefore they may be panicking or feeling unhappy. So make sure you keep checking, keep monitoring your teams, and iron out any issues that are developing between, say, competitive, where two people have done the same job role before and they perhaps clash a little bit on how it should be done. Anything like that you need to iron out, because you do not want to lose staff and having to start recruiting. And good luck. It's not an easy thing to do. Don't beat yourself up if you get halfway through all the paperwork and the partners decide not to merge. It means you've done your job correctly and informed them of all the pitfalls, and perhaps they've decided it's not for them. I know it takes time and a lot of energy, but you don't want to merge unless it's absolutely correct. So put the time in that planning and make sure it's really right for both surgeries to do what they're going to do. If you are going back to the beginning of this, if you are taking over an APMS contract, again, good luck. I hope that works out for you. Again, it's a lot of work and very little gain in those first few months when you're working through it. But it can be satisfying and rewarding to see things happening for the patients that make them happy and make your staff happy, with maybe more opportunities and more chances for people trying to work in a different position, perhaps being able to be upskilled to run that APMS contract, even short term. And don't forget, if you're asking someone to go ahead and run a contract for 6 months, don't forget there should be at least a short-term plan to upskill their pay a little bit. It's not fair to ask someone to run something without any financial reward. So when you have happily watched this video, and I really hope it's helped you, even if it's helped you with a decision that maybe merging isn't for you, it's given you the information that you need and given you a list of things to think about. You will be able to apply for the paperwork. I don't get involved with the admin side of things, so please don't email me. Please go directly to GP Excellence and they will let you know how to get that paperwork. Involved in your bundle of paperwork, there are the following things. There is a plan for a business case for practiced caretaker arrangements within a PCN or within an individual practice. And this is a template that will give you ideas how that can be set out. I will also recommend that I've made a video on project management within GP surgeries, and we go more into how to write a business case within that video. So you may want to watch that alongside this. There will be some forms about TUPE that will give you some ideas for TUPEing for the NHS pension and also TUPEing your staff across for your new contracts and your payroll system to make sure you've done your due diligence and that you've got everything legal. There will be a communications and engagement plan, but as I suggested before, this is just an idea for you. I would always get the ICB to assist you and do a really good quality communications plan that is very specific to your surgeries and your patient population. They have a team there to help you do it. Take that help. You will have enough to do. There are two documents that will help you plan any move. So if you're not moving estates and you're already all in the same building and you're just merging as a practice, you maybe won't need these. But if you have got any kind of movement, it's just some ideas to help you moving both your furniture and seeing if those things work out for you and if you really need to take things with you, or if you're moving the IT system, and then this can be provided for your ICB IT suppliers, which will help them keep track of where perhaps different tag numbers have been moved to, because they need to be fully aware of this. And if you get the IT department involved, they are really helpful to help you with any physical move that you may have to do, as well as helping you with moving that clinical system. So take all the help you can get, you will need it. And finally, there is a pros and cons of merge document. There are examples on there of feelings of why things are good, the pros or the cons. That doesn't mean these are your pros and your cons you have to follow with, but there are certainly headers for you to think about and ideas and examples for how that could work. So this is something that you need to probably work with within your partners and write your own pros and cons, but this will give you an idea of what to put in them. I really hope today has been helpful for you if you are either thinking about taking over an APMS contract or you are in a position where you are discussing a merge, to get you to have that understanding of the complexity and the amount of things that need thinking about before you go ahead and announce to the world that you're merging, because those decisions need to be made in the back, really, and making sure that everything is in place before we start involving everyone else, because it may not happen. And there's no point worrying your staff if there's no way this is going to happen. So make sure you work through all the difficulties and all the challenges with the partners of both surgeries to make sure a merge is really what you want to do. You may not have the luxury of that time if you are taking over an APMS contract. Sometimes that needs to be much, much quicker. So good luck, everyone, and I hope you've found today useful, and thank you so much for your time today. I know you're busy, so thank you and goodbye.